Good evening, everybody. My name is Bradley Shaw. Welcome to Between the Covers. And this evening, we're talking to author Paul J Greguric about his new book, The Man Behind the Prize, A Life of J.F. Archibald. Good evening, Paul. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And how are you?
Good evening, Bradley, and thanks for this opportunity.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. So please tell the readers about the wonderful book you've created, The Man Behind the Prize, please.
I think the best way to explain it is a lot of people would have heard of an American person called Jay Leno, who he's quite a popular fellow on American TV, and he goes into the streets and he asks people general knowledge questions. So he might walk up to a young person and ask them what language is spoken in Denmark, and they'd probably answer something like Denmarkian. Just showing, he likes to show that people don't really know much.
Yeah.
If you were to walk the streets of Melbourne or Sydney and pick anyone and ask them who's the most representative poet in Australia, they'd say Banjo Paterson. Mm-hmm. If they didn't know, you could give them a bit of a hint. Let's say the man from Snowy River. Yeah. They'd say, oh, Banjo Paterson. If you ask them who's our most famous 19th century story writer, they'd say, oh, Henry Lawson. Mm-hmm. And if you ask them who was our most famous female colonial writer, they'd say Miles Franklin, because they've probably heard of My Brilliant Career, her book, or seen her film. Yep. If you were to do the same thing and ask someone who's J.F. Archibald, they probably wouldn't know. They might have heard of the Archibald Prize for Portraiture. And if they're a Sydneysider, they might have seen the Archibald Fountain in our Hyde Park. What they didn't, or what they wouldn't know, is that if it wasn't for J.F. Archibald, we would not have Banjo Paterson, we would not have Miles Franklin, and we would not have Henry Lawson. All three of those writers were first encouraged and published by J.F. Archibald. 2 years ago, before I started the book, I noted that we didn't know anything about Archibald the man. So if you've grown up in Australia, you grow up with the Archibald Prize for Portraiture. Dad opens the newspaper and he says, oh, look who won the Archibald Prize. You know, that's a great painting, or it's not such a good painting, or it doesn't look like him or her. Or we like to look at what's called the packing room prize. And that's the prize that goes to the packers that unpack and pack the paintings for the competition. They actually vote as to their best favourite painting. Wow. And that painting's often a more realistic one than the winner of the Archibald Prize. Yeah. So I was walking past the Art Gallery from the State Library here in Sydney. I just finished a short story called Portraiture, and I knew it was going to be published, and I needed to start a new project. And after finishing something that's fictional, I like to do some non-fiction work, just to clear my mind. And I walked past the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and there was a huge banner, and it simply said, The Archibald. And I thought, well, we don't know anything about him. I'll have to read a book about his life. And to my astonishment, the only book about J.F. Archibald's life, there was a single copy at the State Library, New South Wales. It was written in the 80s by a lady called Sylvia Lawson. No connection with Henry Lawson. I think she sadly passed away a few years ago. Oh. And I requested her book. It was called The Archibald Paradox. It was very thick, and I didn't want to read it. I flicked through it, and I looked at the back to see where she sourced her information from.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it's pretty old now. It's out of print. She probably doesn't have access to things that I've got access to, because I basically lived a few hundred metres away from the Mitchell Library, which is where the archives are kept. And I decided that I'd write a life of J.F. Archibald. And I had to start from scratch because J.F. Archibald, the man, two things. Firstly, he talked a lot, but not about his feelings. And he wrote a lot, but not about his feelings. So he was a bit of an enigma for me. And there was very little of his correspondence, of his writing available. I had to rely on his colleagues and his friends and what they wrote about him. So yeah, that's how the book began. 2 years in the making. Yeah.
That's fantastic, and it's one of those people, like you say, it's such a generalised familiarity with that prize, with that term, Archibald Prize, but yet the intricacies of the man's evolution to that status and the whole journey in his process of Australian culture has never really been identified. I've never known it. I wasn't, until I read your book, I was quite amazed at some of the facets in which you highlighted to him. He had such an influential part in media and design of our culture that I didn't even realise that he was establishing that. And as you say, he first published some of our greatest known entities. So and yet he's such an enigma. So it must have been such a big challenge to create that contrasting of him as a man as well. So really giving that authenticity to him as a person, as you say, because it was so vague, I guess is a term, that there wasn't that history to draw on or lots of, profiles that have been established around him. He just had that one private enigmatic personality. And did you find that frustrating? Did you find that difficult, or was that part of the process where you were able to, I guess, enjoy the writing process of exploration and identifying him?
I enjoyed it because it was detective work.
That's what I mean. The investigation of who's this person.
When you write fiction, you're being creative. When you write about someone's life, biography, it's detective work from day one. And I enjoyed it. I don't know if you enjoy watching detective shows on TV, but
for sure,
I felt like I was being a detective, and also because you're working alone. There's no one that you can turn to and say, "Oh, can you please explain this aspect of his life?" You've got to find it on your own, like a detective.
But there was such history involved too.
And I was looking at original documents every day. And the librarians at the State Library were so significant to this book, by the way. They helped me immensely. I was also learning as I went. You see, it was my first attempt at biography, and I would ask a librarian a question, and then I'd have to say, I'm learning all of this for the first time. And it was a fun ride. There were few moments which are called rosebud moments. Do you know what they are?
Epiphanies.
I was talking to a Californian girl while I was writing the book. She asked me, "How's the book going?" And I said, "I've had a few rosebud moments." And she asked me, "Well, what's that?" And I said, "It's sort of like when you find out something about a person that," and she said, "Oh, what makes them tick?" It's what makes them tick. And I had two rosebud moments. I won't reveal them, so you can find them in the book. But I'll give you the context. I requested a small photograph from the library archives, and the librarian brought it over to me with white cotton gloves, put it in front of me, and what had been written on the photograph was what made Archibald tick.
Wow. That's
That
beautiful.
was the Rosebud moment, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's good that you've had that exploration. I mean, I think reading the book too, the way you've written it, I think you've got more involved with him as a person. I think you had a respect for him, and you really began to want to find out, as you say, what makes him tick, but more so, fundamentally as a human being, as a person, and you really respected a lot of what you wrote about him, and you gave it that dignity. And I think that was really important for that book, because it wasn't just a biography of Archibald was born, Archibald lived, Archibald did this, Archibald did that.
Yeah.
It was, you really personalized and inflected a lot on what it must have been as a person for him living that life.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where it's surprising that you were able to evolve that in the lack of really the evidence and in research that you would have had to dig through to personalize that construction of him.
Yeah, I understand perfectly, Bradley. I had to give him dignity for Australian readers, and for the man himself. A lot people who know anything about Archibald, it's often not accurate. I don't know how that happened. One of the reasons is that you can read about him in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, as you can about every famous Australian. But that passage in that encyclopedia was written by Sylvia Lawson, who wrote the book. Yeah. If you go to look for information on Archibald, it often just goes back to that one entry in the Dictionary of Biography. Yeah. So people didn't really know much about the man, as you said, the person, the individual. As I looked through his notebooks, read what his friends said about him, read what his colleagues said about him, suddenly the jigsaw puzzle of who he was as a person appeared, and I was quite happy with him.
Yeah,
I'd have him at my dinner table any day.
No, you definitely liked him. You could tell in the writing, like you were intrigued by him, and that shows. So did you feel like exhausted or excited, or like how was the process of 2 years of work? Like, did you feel tired writing such things sometimes, and then frustrated, or was it as you say, you had a few moments that were rosebuds, but what was the general overview of writing this book? I mean, it must have been quite...
Good question. My writing method is 2 hours a day, every day. So every day for 2 years, I would walk over to the State Library and write or research for 2 hours, not 3 hours, not 2.5 hours. When that 2 hours was up, I'd go home.
Yep.
And I wouldn't worry about JF Archibald for the rest of the day until 9 o'clock the next morning.
Yep.
I think that's good for sanity. And the thing that can be difficult, or was difficult for me writing this book, is you're doing it alone.
Yeah.
So I would step out of the library. I would have just discovered something fascinating about Archibald or one of his authors, about Miles Franklin.
Yeah.
And I would want to tell someone, and who wants to talk about Archibald's colleagues, that I found that frustrating. Yeah. And I used to think, I just want this book to be in print so people can talk about Archibald. Yeah. And they will. I think, like I said, that's an enjoyable tale as much as it is an authentic representation of his world, of his life and times. Yeah, I think there's a conversation there, I think, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Just evolving that. And I think from the pretense of this book, without being presumptuous, I would say you'll certainly be identified as being the expert on J.F. Archibald for that essence. And I think anyone who's interested in researching further or evolving the thing will have a conversation with you in the future. And all your book will be that reference point. So we're very excited to be behind it and to help you get it out there. So when you're writing the construct of this book, like your first thought is respecting Archibald, but how did you then think, how am I going to entertain readers enough that they want to learn about this man? Because you've really got to, when you write, some writers consciously write for readers, so they'll always write for the purpose of engaging readers, and other writers write for the purpose of the writing. I mean, just it'll be what it is and it'll find its reader. How did you approach the writing construct of the book? Like thinking about the layouts and thinking about how you're going to tell that stories once you've done the research.
Okay, I learnt from the masters. So
Yep.
one of the best biographers of this century is a fellow called A.N. Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
He's written biographies of Tolstoy, the Queen, John Milton. He's the master, and I just read him everything I could. And I also watched YouTube lectures by people who'd just finished a biography.
Yep.
And I wanted to avoid that dry as dust model of biography that you mentioned earlier, which is so-and-so was born on such and such a day. Yeah. And my method, which I instinctively knew I had to do, was to look at the Victorian goldfields where Archibald was born and grew up.
Yep.
And what was it like to be on the Victorian goldfields?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I started. And I even went back earlier, I think, to the original custodians of that land. And it grew from there. And I stayed on, I tried to stay interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Archibald sometimes wrote extensively about things that weren't very interesting to me and I thought weren't going to be to the readers either. So I tried to stay on track. I tried to keep the reader on the tram, as it were.
Yeah. And that's important too, as you say, for biographies. So how long did it take you to physically write the actual book? Like, you've done obviously countable hours of research, but when you sat down and thought, right, now I've got to make that story, how long was that process for you, do you feel?
I walked up to one of the senior librarians when I finished it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I've just finished my Archibald biography. And she said, oh, that's been 2 years.
Yep.
A labour of love. And I thought, has it been that long?
So it wasn't a conscious thing. You obviously got involved in the process.
My method writing this one was research, write. So research. So I wasn't like researching for months and months and months.
Okay, so then so some writers will research a block and then they'll put it all together in a story. You've done it as it's evolved. Right.
Yeah.
Which is good, because in a way you then find out what you need to know next, and that next part you need to complete, and that's probably a good way of doing it as well. So.
It is a good way, a very professional way, but I took a risk because COVID closed down the State Library for 3 months.
It did.
So for 3 months I was out of work.
Yeah. How did you do that? Did you do mostly rewriting or reviewing, or what was your time?
I had a pile of documents that I'd copied, hand copied, that were still sitting there, so I could still write from them. Lucky.
Yeah. Wow. So you obviously have a dedicated passion for writing, so you put a lot of effort into this book. But what other projects or what other pieces of writing have you been doing or have done that viewers might come across? This is your first book published.
Yeah. I published my first story that I was paid for when I was 24.
Yeah, well done.
And I'm ancient now.
Yeah.
The magazine Quadrant, which has got a pretty big readership in Australia. Some people don't like it, but its previous literary editor was a poet called Les Murray. Mm-hmm. Not the soccer commentator, the poet Les Murray. He's passed away, sadly, and he's a very, very good poet. And every time I wrote a short story, I'd send it first to him. He'd always send it back with a comment. He'd always tell me what I did wrong. And then it would go off. My story would go to other magazines. He published 3 of my stories in Quadrant, and they're worth reading. One's called Her Father's Eyes, one's called Arazu, and one's called The Man Who Sold Water to All of Australia. And you can find them online.
Wow. Awesome.
They're worth reading. But when you write short stories, you're not recognised. You do it because you love doing it, and you get a check for $300. That's about it. You don't get recognition. I was only once recognised as a short story writer. I was in a hospital waiting room, and one of the doctors came out and said, "You're Paul, you wrote that short story called Petrushka."
That would have been nice.
It was, yeah. But I was already working on Archibald, and I was already with Shoreline, so I was quite happy.
Yeah. Good. So with the process, with your writing, as you say, like you're ancient like me. So when you started writing, it would have been a different process. But also, was that something you wanted to do? Was that something you knew you were going to evolve to do? Were you looking at other tracks and writing just became part of the journey, or what was your story as you were a young man?
The moral is give up your day job if you want to be a writer. Give up your day job. I became a school teacher. I became an English teacher. And when I graduated here in Sydney, I said to myself, okay, you can be a teacher for 2 years, then you're going to quit, and then you're going to be a writer for the rest of your life.
Yes.
What happened instead is I was a school teacher for 25 years.
Yes.
But in that time, I was what you call a school holiday writer. Mm-hmm. So, but you very difficult to get anywhere that way
in a career, and that's right. Yeah, it needs to have that full-time disciplines.
Yeah,
but it's not as luxury as some people can do as much.
Some people can. Actually, if I can mention that, I resigned from teaching in 2014 to write a novel, and it took me a year to write a novel. Couldn't get it published.
Yeah.
I then spent another 12 months writing another novel. Couldn't get it published, and I ran into a very, very good writer of romantic fiction. I don't read romantic fiction, but I meet Fiona McCullum once a year at a writers' gathering. Yeah. And she said to me, "Paul, once you start full-time writing," well, it took her 9 years to get published. 9 years. And I thought, 9 years, I can't wait that long. Yeah. I've been writing full-time for 6 years.
Yeah.
So,
that's good.
Yeah.
And you're getting there. And I think this book's a good platform for you. I think it'll build a premise that your talent will be recognised, and also, other avenues can be opened with this. I'm confident in the book. I think it's got great strength of character and story and talent that you've created. And marketability wise, I think readers are going to get a lot out of it. So anyone watching, I do emphasise, please grab Paul's book. It's a fantastic story and representation of Australian culture and art, and also history for J.F. Archibald. So please grab it at anywhere books are sold. You can get this book. So tell us, Paul, did you during this journey, do you suffer or have experience with writer's block? Did you find there was any challenging periods where you could not get what you wanted right, or in that book?
With a research-based task writing, I remember having writer's block, because I recall a conversation where I said to a friend, "I just can't do any writing this week," and he said, "Oh, that's writer's block." Oh, of course, of course it is. What you can do if you get writer's block is you can just do stuff to do with writing.
Yep.
So you still sit at your desk for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. You don't have to write anything. You just do stuff associated with writing.
Yeah, like character research or developments.
Exactly. Exactly. Spot on. And because it was research-based, I just did a little bit more research.
That's right. And that gives you an asset too, because you actually find actual benefits out of that time not being wasted. Some writer's block affects writers where the degree of procrastination just freezes them into immobility. They can't actually do anything, let alone writing. So if they can find a productive outlet to regenerate, that's good. And I agree, research is a great buffer for that. So having had I guess such an involved process for this book, with future books, is there something you plan to continue on in non-fiction to become that sort of biographer or identity, or is this a story you've done and you say, I'm going to go off and write something easier like fiction, where I can just maybe relax and just not have to do so much practical work involved in it?
That's a good idea. But I think I might have established myself as a biographer. I think over the years while I was doing creative writing,
Mm-hmm.
I was reading a lot of biography without realising that one day I'd be doing it.
Yep.
And I've got favourite biographers, for example. Some people have favourite authors. I've got favourite biographers, believe it or not. Ian Wilson, Lytton Strachey, who not many people know about, who was from the Victorian era.
Okay.
Lytton Strachey really changed the way we thought about people, like Florence Nightingale. He sort of gave a different angle. Not always a nice one. So I've actually written, it's not written, I've read a biography of Lytton Strachey. So I've read a biography of a biographer.
Okay,
good. We're going back dry as
that's as you say, learning. You've got to learn your craft before you can master it. Yeah. So one thing too we like to identify with our writers is, do you feel you have any interesting writer's quirks? Like some of our authors might, write in a particular pair of shoes. They might play particular music while they're writing. They might write naked. What sort of things do you have that you probably have as this little quirky difference in your writing style?
I will only use the black wing pencil.
That's definitely a quirk.
The black wing Palomino is my favourite.
Wow.
I'll only write with that.
Yeah.
I only write on Moleskine notebook stationery.
Okay. And you transpose that? You type that up yourself again? Or?
And then it's always written on this laptop. Now this is a HP Pavilion.
Yep.
Now this laptop, I've contacted HP and said, look, this thing that you made for me, I've taken it to northeastern Thailand during the monsoon.
Yeah.
During the monsoon for 3 months on a rice farm. It short-circuited.
Yeah.
It was repaired by a local boy, and it's so far written 2 novels and a biography.
Well, I'd say it's blessed. Let's definitely keep that one.
So my quirks are the stuff that I use to write.
Yeah, so you got to have the right tools.
Yeah.
So if you don't have those tools, do you feel there's a lack in fluency, a lack in process for you?
It's not writing anymore.
Not writing. Yep. Wow, it's a very disciplined quirk.
Yeah, I wish I had a fun one.
Okay, so what would you call your writer's kryptonite? Like if you had something that stops you from writing. So, like for me, it has to be like 3 o'clock. I usually like to go and have a nap. So that definitely stops me writing at that time. So what do you find is your kryptonite? Like, do you have a thing that stops you from writing, or even a person perhaps,
I know you asked that question, and I thought about that. And I thought about that, and I thought recently, what has been my kryptonite? And it has been YouTube videos about kittens.
Turn it off.
Because I recently adopted a kitten.
Yeah.
And when you adopt a kitten, there's thousands of videos on what to do when you adopt a kitten. And that took me away from the writing desk. And
absolutely. That's a whole different level of research.
Yeah, I'm annoyed at myself at that level.
So, as you say, you've got cats, or a cat. Yeah. So what else do you do when you're not writing? Like, what other things do you enjoy? What makes you tick?
Because I don't drive a car, never have driven a car, never had a license. I'm a big time walker. Around Sydney, and I'm. If you want to go on a historical walk with someone, come along with me.
Yeah, wow.
Because I noticed one of the questions you ask is about literary pilgrimage.
Yes.
Yeah, I've done pilgrimages around Sydney. And I'll do that. Yeah.
And why wouldn't you? We watch a show on telly. It's ABC, I think, or SBS, and it's about renovations and restorations in Australia. And it's a fascinating show. Not just like, I'm not really a handyman per se for all the building, techniques, but I love seeing the older houses, cultural houses, built and restored, and the stories that they tell and the histories of those houses. And in Sydney, they do some fantastic restorations of some properties up there. We saw one recently. It was the original house of when Sydney was basically standing stone in Pier 1. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. But history in Sydney is phenomenal. It's a beautiful place. Even the Writers' Centre, I think, is in the Roselle House, isn't it? Is it still in that property? The private was donated.
Now there's a story
Yeah.
The New South Wales Writers' Centre is based in Callan Park, which is where J.F. Archibald was a patient.
Oh, there you go.
So the New South Wales Writers' Centre is actually on the premises of a former mental hospital.
Well, there you go. Some trivia that people wouldn't pick up. That's right. Yeah. There you go. Glad I mentioned it. But yeah, so you do a lot of walking and you do a lot of reflecting and history research, like just taking in pride of Sydney.
I live in the Sydney suburb of Waterloo.
Yep.
And just outside my window, in the colonial era, was swampland, and that's where the Aboriginal warrior Pemulwuy used to do his guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, wow.
And the British Army under Captain Tench, Lieutenant Tench, tried to capture him just outside my balcony here, but his soldiers sank in quicksand.
Wow. Oh gosh.
I know stuff like that.
There's definitely some stories to tell and hear when catch up. I'm hoping too, after COVID, after all these times happen, we'll be up in New South Wales soon to catch up with you and other writers that I'm hanging to meet and have coffee with and hear some of these stories. I'd love you to sit with me and tell me more of these stories. So for you, what, if I can ask, what is the most difficult part of an artistic process as a writer for you? Like, do you find, the editing process, the revision process, the incubus of the idea and development process? What to you is the hardest part of that process?
I'm a poor man. I'm a poor man, so I had to write this book living on, not much money. That was difficult. That was difficult. The other aspect that was tricky is I was worried that Australian publishers wouldn't see the value of what I was doing.
Yeah.
I knew that I had some story that had to be told, that hadn't been told. Yeah. And I was hoping that Australian publishers would recognise that.
Yeah.
And that time when you're thinking, is it going to be recognised or not, can be very, very frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you get feedback first, or did you find feedback positive, supportive?
I was unhappy that some of the bigger, more responsible publishers didn't see the value of the work I was doing.
Yeah.
Then again, they're busy doing stuff.
Well, there's no excuse too. I agree. I mean, publishing industry is probably one of the most challenging it's been in a phase that's transitioning a lot in the last 10, 15 years. Yeah. I've seen even the last 5 years, I've seen a real change in dynamics. I think writers, authors have to take ownership and responsibility for a lot of their goals and future. So. I don't think they can rely on traditional publishing networks as it used to be. Yeah. And I think individual commitment to their goal and their passion of their books has to be identified firstly from themselves.
Yes.
And that's where Shoreline's model comes in to help build you those profiles and support you with all the resources you need. So no, I mean, I understand that as a frustration, and I'm glad that, you've embraced the different strategy and you came to us and we helped, get it out there, because I'm really, really happy and proud of that book. And I think you will be, and the readers watching should definitely get a copy and enjoy, because it's so well written and honest and earnest in two elements of this man who we don't really know in history. And I'm going to leave it to you to read and to learn about, because it's fantastic. Paul, really, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. I wish we had more of it, but please. One more question. Share with us, if you could, the advice you would give a new and upcoming writer, a younger man coming up in today's age. What would you say to them?
I would say write every day either 1,000 words or write for 2 hours, whatever you find suits you best. Yeah. 2 hours or 1,000 words.
Very good.
Yeah. And I didn't invent that.
No. And it's about discipline too. The craft of being a writer isn't just about sitting down to write when you want to write. It's about writing when you learn to write as a writer. Yes, it's a discipline. So great advice, Paul. Thank you so much. You take care. For everybody watching, again, can't say it enough. Grab a copy of this book. It's awesome. And thank you, Paul. Be well and be safe. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Bradley.
Now.